I'm your host, Dean Ramsden, and today I'm joined on the phone by Rosalyn L. Bruyere. Rosalyn is an internationally acclaimed energy healer, an experienced clairvoyant, and a medicine woman. Through frequent collaborations with physicians and scientists, Rosalyn has, and continues to do so, awakened the world to the power of energy healing and to the importance of the medicine and shamanic traditions across the globe. Rosalyn's knowledge and experience straddles many traditions. She has been recognized and honored as a ritual elder in the Hopi Kiva, the African hut, and the Tibetan temple alike, as well as being a passionate teacher of the ancient Egyptian mysteries and the Western magical traditions. From the viewpoint of today's professional energy healer, Rosalyn is the originator of the foundational healing skills taught across the Western world, such as the chelation technique and the brain balancing skill. She continues to travel and teach extensively, along with her husband, Ken Weintraub, and is especially welcomed in Europe. And I'm personally delighted to be talking to her today. Rosalyn, what did I leave out from my introduction? What did I leave out that you would like people to know about you and your teaching work?
Actually, in addition to all of that, I'm a dedicated Christian pastor. And in energy medicine, there aren't very many of us who still consider ourselves Christians and constantly seek to figure out what kind of healer Jesus might have been and what kind of healing he might have passed to the disciples. And of course, I'm particularly aware of it now because we're just a couple of weeks past Easter, and every Easter I deliver a sermon having to do with that Christian base, which is what I was originally educated in. Most of the spiritualists in the Western world are Christians, not necessarily Christians that are recognized by other Christians, but our background is still very much that Christian mystery tradition.
Now, have you found that as time goes by, your dedication to Christianity or to the teachings of Jesus, has that become more important to you as a healer, or has it always been there?
No, it's always been there, and I'm a typical Californian. I like whatever's new to me, so everything I happen to be into at the moment is probably what I talk about to other people about. And as you mentioned, I'm dedicated to the Tibetan bone tradition, to my Native American roots. Officially, I'm 1/8 Native. So there are a lot of things that make up the complexity of a professional healer, and I'm grateful to all those traditions because they each had a wisdom teaching that I have found easily usable in certain circumstances. For instance, when I was teaching in Israel, I chose to teach the Native American medicine wheel because I didn't bump up against the three great religions that way and could teach sound healing holistic principles using a format that somebody wouldn't be reactive to. And so choosing, one thing after another, I think, helps you to move around people's biases so that they're not reactive, but rather receptive. And receptivity is really important in the client. Often people think that they have to have faith in the healer. They don't. They just have to not be pushing back. And if you can just get that minor level of neutrality in a client, then I think you've accomplished something great. Because if you can teach them to take in all the energies that they'll need to heal themselves, then we're ahead of the curve.
I'm very caught by your statement, it's not about faith, it's about something else, something where something gets through to the client that normally wouldn't get through to them. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Well, quiet as it's kept, my background is actually electrical engineering. And that's why I became devoted to touch healing. Because for me, it was the same as soldering the wires together. Once you've touched them, you've broken their electric circuitry and infused in it another energy field that allows a shift or a change to take place. So though I certainly would pray for someone if they asked me to, I don't do much distance work. I don't do much that doesn't involve directly touching a patient. Because I really like, when I'm touching them, to give energy and to feel what the resistance levels, and I mean that in an electrical sense, not psychological sense, that the patient's body has. So that's something that I think, if you throw your scientific mind out the window, which most Western people have spent a lot of time developing, you're doing a misservice to yourself and to the client. But if you throw your faith base out, you're also doing a disservice, because somebody, once those two fields are kind of fused together in treatment, somebody between the two of you has to have faith. That's probably my responsibility. Somebody probably has to have receptivity. That would be the client. It's like what happens in a good marriage. You divide up the chores by who can handle what at what time. A lot of us who are married know that we don't do everything that the spouse does better. But if the spouse weren't there, we'd probably be able to muddle through. It just wouldn't be the same. And so the same is true, because in professional energy healing, there's a symmetry between that connection that causes synthesis and the ability to move somebody forward. And for so many of us who are energy healers, we're trying to teach transformation while we're trying to avoid transformation at the same time. But I've learned a kind of a professional trick that I always do. If I have to go to work, for instance, on a native reservation where there's a great deal of difficulty with addiction, I will take one of my own addictions, and at least a week before I go, I will do everything I know to fight that addiction in myself. Now, often it's something as simple as I'll just give up sugar, or I'll just give up bread. Whatever it is that seems to be at this moment the thing that I probably don't need and won't give up. By that, my field is carrying the energy. Oh, please. I have greyhounds. Can you tell?
I can tell.
I'm so sorry. They just so wanted to participate today. If I just have in me the ability to fight something, it might encourage somebody else to fight something that I believe is harder than what I'm fighting. But at least I'm authentic when I say it's fightable, because I'm in the process of fighting something.
So if I understand you correctly, you're using your own experience of both engaging, let's say, the addiction. We're talking about addictions right now. You're using your own experience. Are you also inviting other support, let's say spirit realm or teachers from the past that you've had, ritual elders that have influenced you? Are you also inviting them to join you in looking at the addiction?
Yes. And if I'm in a circumstance, for instance, as I would be on a native reservation, I'm going to remember all the native elders who've generously given to me the ability to see what my limitations were and have compassion for my limitations and faith. They held faith that I would overcome them. And I'm in that position now for this new person. So it's a lineage. It's a lineage from those teachers through my teachers. Some of them are in the spirit realm. Some of them are the spirits of the land you're working on. When I'm working in Hawaii, I'm very aware of the energy of the island that I'm on, whichever one it happens to be, because there are sacred forces that come from the land, from the trees, from the animal life, even from the sea when you're there, that make themselves supportive of humans refining themselves. It's almost as though nature knows that if we can just make a human more refined, they're less dangerous to nature. So if I use that energy that's right there trying to refine me and calm me and fill me, then I can work with the people who live there in the same way. And I'm a little more receptive to some parts of it that they live with every day, that they take for granted and don't let in.
So it's your orientation. You're doing a lot of pre-orientation before you even work with a client to make yourself accessible to these resources and also to look for, I'm guessing, new ways to deal with the addiction or whatever you're working with your client.
Yeah, it could be the addiction, it could be an illness, it could be an aging process. I treat a lot of people who have recovered from cancer. And if they had extensive radiation or chemotherapy, it probably aged them 10 years. So what I'm working with is reversing that aging in the way that I understand it and the way I remember them before they were ill. I've always been taken with the myth about Isis and Osiris, where she puts his body back together, and the text is written that she remembers him. She puts his members back together. She reunifies him. So whoever that person was, I'm not focusing on the was that, for whatever reason, contracted a disease. I'm focusing on the vitality they had, the energy they had, the spirit they had, and accessibility to hope. Because a lot of the things that these patients go through has a deleterious effect on their brains, on their bones, on their liver, on their kidneys. And I want to go back to the stem cell in each of those organs and reignite them as being more important than the damaged cells.
I'm speculating that what you're speaking of is not just a reboot of the system. It's actually a new synthesis, a new integration of that person after the traumatic event. Would that be correct?
Yes, that's accurate. When people have trauma and they spend their time working on the trauma, sometimes they make the trauma bigger than it ever was because it was so devastating to them. But if you go to the place that is still there because it made it all the way through the trauma and out the other side, and you now focus on the part that maintained itself and had integrity all the way through, and give it power to now live, not ignoring what happened, not, erasing it, but rather knowing the gallantry with which they moved through the almost impossible and came out the other end. And I think a lot of the old-fashioned virtues, I think the one thing the wise people of all these different lineages have taught me is that there are certain noble human qualities that our modern culture is in danger of throwing away, like chivalry, compassionate care, like the nobility of overdoing on someone else's behalf. We've had about 50 years now of a kind of narcissistic view of how we are important and have to take care of ourselves. If I go to one more healing conference where there's a presentation on healer burnout, and I wonder why there is any healer burnout, because, by the way, you're in the privileged position of having the whole world of life force flow through you on behalf of someone else. You could have taken a sip as it went through, by the way. Instead of whining about how hard you work, could you focus on what you learned, on how you grew? Could you make notes for yourself? Could you figure out what you would like to tell another healer who might be in that situation in the future? So that you're focusing, you develop an eye that looks at the positive more than the negative, because the negative is always going to be there. And it's always going to be talked about because people like to whine and talk about the awfulness. But who's going to talk about virtue? Who's going to talk about integrity? Who's going to talk about value system? Who's going to talk about faith? Who's going to talk about the future? And that's the thing that's the most important. As we go through life, we go to another future. And are we ready for that? Now, part of this is, I'm getting older, so as I get older, I'm looking at, okay, probably the clock is ticking for me. I'm not very aware of it most of the time, but it is. Am I prepared to go through into the next incarnation? I need to gather to myself now all the things that I would want to pass to somebody else so that they also pass with me to the next dimension. And for the client, they're going through a process where I want them to focus on what they're learning that they want to take into their future life. I don't mean their next incarnation. I mean just their post-stress life. When they go back to their family and they go back to their friends and they go back to their community. Because people are transformed by their illnesses. But I don't believe that illness's purpose is to transform you. I think illness is something that we've all tried to make a cause célèbre, and I don't think it is. I think it's just plain illness. and carelessness and bad food and water, and, there's 100 things that could make us all sick.
Yes.
And those of us who live in big cities can tell you about traffic and stress and pollution and water supply and food supply. And, there's plenty to get to you here if you let it. And there's also plenty of, it's spring in California. My gosh, my neighborhood is in bloom. I came home from Germany a few weeks ago, got out of the car to take my luggage in, and the whole neighborhood smelled like orange blossom. You've never smelled anything like it. It was like overwhelming, because I just left winter in Germany. It snowed half the days I was there. And then to come into, it's like, oh yeah, this is why I live in California. Where the air may be polluted, but it sure smells good.
My mind is buzzing with multiple implications of what you're saying. Probably the biggest thing that's going through it right now is how you started in stressing your spirituality, your Christianity, because as we know, Christianity is not just about the worship or adoration of the divine, it's also about good works. It's about charity.
Absolutely. Yes, it is.
And
forgiveness.
And forgiveness, and doing a spiritual journey that includes human frailty and human weakness and elevating them to a higher purpose. And I wonder whether with the excessive psychological emphasis on a lot of today's energy healing, professional energy healing, whether that takes people in a direction that isn't helpful, rather than taking them towards a more spiritual, albeit Christian perspective. What do you think?
I've had a 44-year-long war with psychology because I've seen the best of it, and I've seen a lot of the worst of it. And a lot of the people that psychology teaches them all the problems and none of the solutions, and that it emphasizes self-examination until you've crowded out everyone else because you're only examining yourself and you forgot that there are people living with you. That's one of its big disadvantages. And the Christian value would be to put others ahead of yourself, and in the process gain some spiritual perspective. Now, there's a balance, because I've also worked a lot in convents and monasteries in Europe with people who lived in the religious life and seen them overdo and make a deity out of sacrifice, as opposed to just sacrificing a normal amount because someone else has more need than you. And so there's all of these things have to be held in some kind of balance. The people who emphasize the psychological, I think, are also stuck in the intellectual. So there's no room for the psyche and the mysticism and the miracle, because they've crowded it out entirely with intellectual theories and postulates, and you're trying to analyze the patient and look them up in the DSM-4 to see what page they're on. And I don't know if you've looked at it lately. That's the Guide for Psychiatric Care. But I can open it anywhere and read. The thing's about 500 pages. You can open it to any page and find every member of your family. Yeah, it gets about 35 more pages each year. And so, you open it and you go, oh, yeah. And if you're having a bad day yourself, you go, oh, look, this is me. But if you're having a good day, you see it in other people. And the problem for most healers is they're doing to the patient more than they're doing with the patient. So if I'm involved in transformation, I can better help the transformation of the client. But if I'm not involved in it at all, and I'm applying to them energy as though it were a pill, it's like take 2 Zaps and call me in the morning instead of 2 aspirin. It's not cooperative medicine. It's applying a different drug in the same way that allopathic medicine applies drugs. And, recently, particularly here in America, once they stopped limiting how many drug ads there could be on television, their lawyers now make them list some of the contraindications for some of these drugs. And if you listen to those contraindications, you would never want to take the drug. I was in the hairdressers the other day, and I opened a common women's magazine that's been in every household in America since I was a child. And there were 85 pages of drug ads in a woman's magazine. Some of the ads are 3 pages long because it's, the pretty ad showing the person who successfully takes the drug, and then there's all the reasons you should take it, and then on the back page are all the contraindications and what you can and can't take it with, and then sometimes it even goes into a 3rd page where they'll give clinical trial information. It's all in very fine print, and why it's in a women's magazine, I don't know, because I would think their doctor should have that information. I'm not sure the patients need quite that much. So what's happening is, at the same time as cooperative medicine is becoming more and more visible and more accessible, medicine is fighting back with more drugs, more ads, more bombarding of people that you just take a pill and it'll be better. So you've got some kind of weird balance. I have granddaughters who are adult now. They don't remember a time when there weren't drug ads in women's magazines. My children don't remember a time. And they're in their 40s.
So is part of the implication here that everything can be diagnosed, everything has a label, and if you once you've labeled something, you give the appropriate medication versus exploring what's actually going on with the illness or the disease?
Well, and if you're any good at energy healing, which it is rumored that I am, I have never, ever had a patient that had only one thing wrong with them. They come to me with the diagnosis that medicine cannot help them with, but once I get in there, there's all these other things that are unattended. And I'm not talking about the psychological or the spiritual. I'm talking about somebody didn't tell the diabetic that the nerve pain they have is from the diabetes, and now they have neuropathy. And because they've been on insulin a long time, their kidneys aren't working right. So you've got this cascade effect, and they report the one thing that they're worried about and that they have a clean diagnosis for, but medicine didn't bother to diagnose the other things. I remember 30 years ago, I got fascinated with heart disease because of all the silly things. I was flying across country to a conference, and all that was on the airplane to read was the Reader's Digest, and there was an article about heart disease being the #1 killer of all adults in the Western world. And it still is, by the way. It's still 1 in 2 people will die of a heart attack. And that statistic hasn't changed very much over 30 years. So I decided to do some heart research, and because we had a technique, chelation, that really did tend to lessen the plaque in the arteries and reduce blood pressure and had a lot of beneficial effects, we thought we would give 10 treatments to a client. And they brought these clients in. We did a whole protocol, and we had a cardiologist, and they would bring the patient in. I would paint the aura, and then we would videotape me giving them a treatment, and they had a protocol they followed. I was so shocked because there was so much about heart disease that once I had to paint the auras of 10 heart disease patients who had all had a single myocardial infarction. They'd all had one kind of heart attack and were in treatment post-heart attack. None of them had the same other symptoms. So in one, the liver was affected, in another one, the kidneys were affected, and in another one, the joints were affected. And most shocking for me as a woman, women with heart disease tend to have problems in the abdominal aorta that men never have because they never wear a waist belt that tight. I mean, just the simple mechanics of it blocks that artery. And people can't, the doctor never said to the woman, you can't wear tight belts anymore. Yet they had a bruit in that aorta. And it was like, wait a minute, why isn't this in the literature? Because whenever we're involved in a research project, not only do the cardiologists and the other scientists do a literature search, I do too. And none of what we were finding had ever been peripherally recorded in the literature. They just can't think in a circle. They can only think in a line.
Is it as linear as that in your experience? Because I know you've done a lot of research. Do scientists and medical people tend to remain within the bounds of what they're already looking for, and you come in and help them open up those boundaries? Is it as simple as that or more complex?
It's a little more complex, but that's the basic idea. That's definitely the basic idea. What's happening now in medicine is medical school is culling who they accept for that linear left brain thinking and computer savviness and mechanical knowledge. And they're not culling for the compassionate care aspect. And then by the time they're out of medical school, where they were never treated compassionately, by the way, they come out the other end trained in this particular kind of science. I have excellent physician friends. One of them's a world-class endocrinologist. He's quite a bit older than I am now, but he's painfully shy. He was a research endocrinologist from the very beginning of his career. He knows more about it than anybody else here in town. He's the one that does all the brain medications for people for the local psychiatric circle, and he never looks at you when he's dealing with you because he's painfully shy, and nothing in his experience ever took him out of that. So if I refer people to him, which I often do, I have to tell them, by the way, he's never going to look you in the eye. Don't let that put you off. He's really smart. Because I've sent people to him. They've come back and said, I'm not sure, Rosalyn. Are you sure he even knows who I am? And you know, it's a personality trait, and I don't think it's going to change. He's 87 and still practicing and still needed in the world. So what happens is we've got these things, and I'm perfectly willing to be the person who comes in and says, you got to remember there's a patient on the other end of you. But healers, because we've all had medical care, tend to look at the medical care model and emulate it even though we don't intend to. We tend to talk down to the client. We tend to apply energy as though it were a drug. You know, we have this me healer, you client, and we all mouth that we're going to work in complementary medicine and that we're going to work in companionship with the client. People aren't very good at companioning other people because that's not part of our training. So it's one of the things that I've worked really hard at training people to do, professional healer training.
At the end of this interview, I do want to give you some time to talk about the work you're doing to train professional energy healers, both here in the US and also in Europe. But if we just talk generally, before we move into that segment, what counsel, what advice could you give, let's say, a new energy healer, someone just starting out and looking around for a role model, a mentor, or even a training program that would help them go in the right direction? What elementary or basic counsel would you give them from your experience?
Part one, pick somebody to train you that you actually like. Don't pick somebody that you're going to be afraid of. Don't pick somebody that you're in awe of. Pick somebody that you like so that you can have a respectful attitude towards somebody that knows more than you do, but also a feeling of safety so that you can let yourself be seen so that they can help you with the areas that you haven't developed. One of the hardest things for those of us who have a following, I know you do as well, and so does your gorgeous wife, the people who we're trying to train hold us in so much awe that they're afraid to let us see them, and then we can't help them in those areas.
Yes.
And they assume because we're clairvoyant that we can see something that they're very carefully hiding from us. And every human knows how to do that. Every human knew how to hide something from their parents, who they also held in some esteem, and also were very psychic when it came to their children. So we have evidence that that's not going to work. So part one, find somebody you like. Part two, allow yourself to regrow your own body in the direction of an energy healer's body. Now, what I mean by that is everybody has a certain amount of life force, and you can be taught to run energy, and everybody that I've ever trained could do it to some degree. But when your body starts to change, and it will, because you're now using your body as a conduit for all these forces. You have to feed that body just like it's an athletic body. It needs more minerals. It probably needs more protein. It needs a whole bunch of stuff that, say, a mystic's body wouldn't need. It needs some muscle strength, some bone strength. So some of us do a fair amount of physical training to get our bodies to shift a little bit. And it's not a big shift, but the biological has to change as much as the psychological and the spiritual. And that actually takes time. How long would it take a 50-year-old man to get the muscle tone back that he may have had in his 20s? About 2 years. It's not going to happen in a weekend seminar. You can feel it, but because it's the same kind of energy that you get building muscles, sometimes your muscles will hurt a little bit, sometimes your bones will hurt. And the other thing is you become more sensitive, and all the stuff that you walk around numb to, you actually start to feel.
Yes. Yes.
And so you have to get accustomed to knowing that living in a body isn't 100% comfortable. And then at some point you start to separate. You know, often the healers I train will put their hands on somebody and feel something in their own body that isn't theirs, but it's their body telling you where their distress is. And since you didn't have it before you touched the person, you're not going to have it when you let go. But it's the two auras communicating with each other, giving you information. You have to be a little forewarned about that, because people will go into fear over it. And, you know, it's nothing to be afraid of, but I understand why they do. There's a lot of dramatic interpretations. You see it in film and you see it in books that the healer took on the illness and like that. If your life didn't grow the illness, you probably can't keep it. It's my attitude toward that. But I understand the first time you feel something that you didn't expect to feel. It's pretty frightening.
Yes.
But you need that kind of help. The third thing you need is you need to understand that you're on some kind of spiritual journey that isn't restricted to one religion. But it is restricted to the soul reaching out to merge with other souls. And there's a teaching about that in almost every major world religion. Every religion has healers and healing traditions. It's not exclusive to one religion or another. So once you understand that, you can be receptive to it. Now, I have a lot of friends who write spiritual books and who read spiritual books. I try to read my friends' books. But other than that, I'm not very involved with them because they don't teach me anything. I mostly, for spiritual advice and help, read novels. Because in a novel, there's a conclusion at the end of the novel where good overcomes evil. And along the way, those characters are fighting or portraying the good versus evil conflict. And I actually get more of a spiritual lesson out of novels usually than I do spiritual books who only talk about the light, or psychological books that only talk about the dark. Where you have a whole package is in literature, where you have good versus evil all the time. If I get depressed, I want something as simplistic as Sherlock Holmes. If I'm not depressed, I want something much more complicated. And I think that many people are the same way. If you look at what people are reading on airplanes that rests them, there's a lot of popular literature where good versus evil is the theme. I have another little bias. This is an aside, doesn't have to do specifically with healing, but so many of us who are healers are channelers of energy and channelers of energies that come through us that may be vocal or expressed in other ways. Because I live and work in Hollywood, I'm privileged to work with a lot of very high-profile people. When they're performing a concert, they're channeling 35,000 people.
Yes.
And we're struggling to channel through and for one other person, 20 students, whatever. We need to look at what they go through in their training to be able to handle that much, and how big a support team it takes to put one performer singing in front of 35,000 people. There's about 150 people backstage that are making that happen. There's dancers, there's backup singers, there's an orchestra, there's lighting directors, there's a whole thing. And the ancient world, what we had was we had temple life, where you had all the different members of the temple supporting these high holidays, high holy days. And one priest or priestess became the channeler, and the divine spoke through them for the holiday. Once you understand what people are drawn to today, why do people care what Kim Kardashian wore? Well, because she's speaking to some part of a large number of people's psyche that they're not getting in their own personal life or their own archetypal life. And maybe we need to find out what it is that ignites us. So for all the healers, we have to figure out what ignites us. And then we have to learn to enjoy it. You know, some of us are so educated that we don't love common things. Since Ken and I visited you guys in Japan, I've been on a Hello Kitty kick, and all I have to do is mention it, and Hello Kitty appears everywhere around me. The German students brought me Hello Kitty socks. Now, where they found Hello Kitty socks, I don't know. But they did, and they brought me Hello Kitty socks because it was cold in Germany. So what happens is it's allowing me to be part of the common mentality of little girls from age 3 to 70. And be in a kind of lovely, feminine, everything cute world. And to feel why people are attracted to something that simple. Because the image is really very simple. But it makes you laugh.
Well, doesn't it also give you an entry point into a new culture? I mean, in this case, you know, your cute example is through the young girl who, you know, is into cuteness, which is very important in Japan, as you noticed. But doesn't that also give you an energetic in to the culture, which allows more information from that wisdom, that culture to come in your direction? What do you think?
Yes. And the fact that it's simple design, it's not gaudy, and, you know, when you're in Japan, what you notice is good taste is everywhere. If you walk down through a shopping area in America, there's such diversity that it's discordant. You can't find a unifying thread. There are certain things. I mean, you know, when you're in New York City, there are certain dress codes that everybody follows, so you've got a unifying theme. And some of us can do that and some of us can't. When I'm there, I always look down, and I've made one mistake in my wardrobe where I don't match them, you know, because I'm, to my core, a Californian. And so gaudy is always better than good taste. But this process of trying to fuse with other and finding a common language, in this case it was a visual language, that's another thing that's very important to healers. Healers can't live in a world where we all speak this new age chakra jargony parlance. We need to speak to other people in the language that they speak. Now, in my case, because I work in other countries, I'm highly dependent on a translator. But I'm also dependent on listening to their language. And I can tell a great deal from the way they talk as much as I can from what they're saying, which I can't understand until I'm told what they said. So in that process, you can see the energy coming through and making sound in somebody. I can tell in my patients whatever they're telling me. You know, I have some patients who are pretty quiet on the table because they go into an altered state and they stay that way. I have others who never shut up. And I can ask them over and over again, it's time for you to, you know, stop giving out and just take in. It doesn't do any good until you threaten them. This is not good form, but I do. I keep a roll of duct tape in my healer treatment room, and if they won't be quiet after the first half of the session, I put the duct tape on the pillow next to their head. I've never actually had to tear any duct tape. That's always worked.
But it's the shadow of the whip. It's the threat that works.
Exactly.
You're very dedicated to your American and local students. And also, increasingly, you and Ken have been working in Germany, especially.
Yeah, the one country I never wanted to visit in my life.
Be careful what you say never to, right?
I know. That was my lesson.
But in conversations you and I have had separately, you've told me how much that has changed your perspective in working with the cultures interculturally. Could you speak a bit about healers, energy healers working between cultures, the challenges?
Yeah, I can. I'm lucky. I live in a multicultural city. In my immediate practice here, I'm working with 4 or 5 different cultures all the time and always have. When I'm in Germany, which tends to be a little bit of a monoculture, what I've learned from them is, first of all, you learn first how they're not like Americans. And then the second 10 years, you learn how they're exactly like Americans. And what you're learning is there are differences between your interpretation of your own culture and their interpretation of their culture. And then the second decade, you learn all the ways that all cultures are exactly the same. That all women like a certain level of contact, and they need a lot of contact with each other. All men like a certain bravado, and they like something that pushes back a little bit on them. And, first of all, probably half of America's German heritage, or European heritage at least. And so you can see the Germans are so hardworking, and they do so much more of their homework than my American students. That for a teacher, it's divine to work in Germany. It's just divine. Because, you give somebody a task and they actually do it, and you can tell they did it because they come back and they question from their experience of having done. You can tell who didn't because they'll ask questions like, well, if I do that, what will happen? The German students said, I did this, but I couldn't tell what happened. That's a legitimate question. So what happens when you work interculturally is you're looking for the place where we're the same, because that's how your energy connects. And then you're loving and honoring and respecting differences that they hold dear that you might not think are important, but they do. When we were just there, we had one of our American students who lives in Hawaii who came to Germany. And it was during the election of the Pope. And finally he took me aside and he said, Rosalyn, everywhere I go they're talking about the Pope. Why is this important? Well, it's not important in Hawaii. And he had no idea that there are vast parts of the world where the election of the Pope is a big deal. And where people talk about it and care about it. He was completely astonished because he lives in a more secular world and does business in that world. Whereas if you're there, Christianity is pretty much everywhere you look, which in modern America it's not as much anymore. In fact, it's almost being shunted out of existence. So you're looking for, there, I can use a homily from the Bible as an example.
Yes.
Here, nobody's read the Bible and they don't know what I'm talking about. So I have to find the virtue and talk about the virtue directly. There, I can actually draw them into an analogy. Do you see the difference?
Well, I'm very much drawn not only to the difference, but to the need to be multiculturally educated so that you can go to where the client needs you to go rather than make them come to you.
Yes. Because I only have an energy connection that's as strong as the broad band of connection I have with them. If there's only a slight connection between the two of us, I can only give energy on that narrow little wire. But if I can enter, and they'll let me enter into their culture. And by the way, people are very generous with healers. They'll share their culture with you. They'll share their food with you. Most of the cultures I've been in give me my own spiritual name or a version of the name that's unique to their language.
Mm-hmm.
So when you have that experience, they're trying to meet you halfway. They're trying to connect with you. And pretty much it's easy in those instances. But in instances where it's not easy, like when a patient is very sick and therefore very afraid, you really do need to get into theirs. Because they're too afraid to try anything else. So you have to bridge that gap. And if you love cultures, and I do, I mean, I think healers need to love cultures. I think it might be a, necessary quality. You get to see other people and how they live and what their ceremonies are and how their food is different and how it came from their area and how they value different things and like different colors. And, a lot of it's superficial and a lot of it's quite deep.
Well, perhaps travel and exposure to other cultures also erodes our narcissism, the cultural narcissism we talked about earlier in the interview. It's hard to maintain your unconscious specialness in the face of other cultures that do it, in some cases, better than your culture of origin.
Correct. That's absolutely correct. Where we live here in California, we live in the middle of a large apartment complex, and we have two tenants that live in one corner, and they're both German women. They've been friends since they were teenagers. They've lived here in the complex with us quite a long time, and we always joke about going over to that corner of the complex for a little daily visit to Germany. They've done the whole garden like it would be a German garden, and there's gnomes in it, and there's cutesy things and flower arrangements, and she's out breaking up leaves every day. And there's a part of me that's just so relaxed that somebody is still caring that way for their corner of the universe. Less and less we have that in America. But there are parts of the world where people still have it, and sometimes people have it especially when they're in another culture. They cling to their own culture.
Yes.
They start learning more about it because they're not immersed in it. And so there's a kind of an interest that you get when you travel a lot. I was left alone in a pub in Germany this last trip, and these men were discussing cheese. They were off. One was Swiss, one was French, one was Irish, and they were talking about food distribution and cheese distribution. It was a business meeting, and I was a table away from them, sitting by myself, trying not to overhear their conversation. And they kept talking about American cheese, and none of them have been to America or ever had American cheese. And as they were talking about it, I thought, yeah, that's so typical of people who are stuck in their own world. And they were trying to figure out how they were going to get distribution to America and from America because they needed to swap products, but they didn't really get the differences. And they have no idea that America's become totally foodie, They have no idea. It was just this funny, wonderful conversation. It was in English because the Irishman didn't speak the other two languages. Not American English, by the way.
You've been so generous with your time tonight, but I do want to give you some time to talk about your vision, you and Ken, what you want to create for the future, training healers, teaching about energy work. What is your goal or what is your vision for the work you're doing, you and Ken are doing right now in the world?
I think the most important thing we're doing is we're training the next couple of generations of healers. And the reason I think that's important is we're going to be more and more needed, not less and less. As medicine becomes more and more high-tech, somebody to keep the patient human is more and more needed. And we're needed to integrate the patient. We're needed to stop the pain so that they're no longer afraid. There is a greater need for us. One of the things that medicine is in crisis about is that the new doctors don't want to train the next generations of doctors. They want to get away from all that training as soon as they can. So nobody's helping the new doctors, not in the way that we help new healers. Yet 100 years ago, medicine was all about training the next group of doctors. Everyone felt it was their responsibility to go back to medical school and teach what they knew. So what's happening is as you materialize a system like that, you're losing the humanity from it. And so for the last decade, I think we've spent equal time training healers and training doctors. we have an awful lot of medical people in our program. And it's because they're getting the rest of the training that they missed in their own training. They're getting mentored, they're getting talked to, they're getting help, they're understanding themselves better so they know how they can serve. And so those are the kind of things I'm the most interested in. I'm still very interested in research. I have 2 potential things on the docket right now. One is an autism study, and the other is a PTSD study for the VA. I will always do that because there's a scientific part of me that just wants the facts actually recorded instead of us making them up. And I learned so much in that circumstance. And interestingly, in research, you actually have a lot of success with the healing treatments you're trying to give because there's a lot of pressure and extra energy of all those people who are engaged in the research project. So those would be the 2 things I think that probably the rest of my life will probably be about, training and research. I still maintain a very, very small private practice because I don't want to be teaching something I don't currently do.
Yes.
Because I think in our auras, whether we're talking about theory or whether we're talking about something we do, it is actually perceivable by the student. So I need to be coherent with what I'm teaching. But as I said, it's a very small practice. I'm not home enough to run a really big private practice like I did when I was young and used to treat 20 to 30 people a day, 6 days a week. And I didn't whine about healer burnout. I did whine about not getting any sleep because I had little children. And so I healed for long hours and then did laundry. So I was always complaining about not getting enough sleep.
So people can come to your website?
We have a lovely German website, which is my name, .de instead of .org.
Yes.
And that's fun to look at because it's in both languages.
Yes.
And we do encourage all of our students to go everywhere and meet all the other healers. That for us is like, you need to build a colleagueship and a tribe. And our tribe can't really be stuck in one place because illness isn't. Thank you for asking me that. I would have forgotten.
You're welcome. Well, I will post. Actually on the website. We're always posting your schedule, so anyone listening to this interview can find your schedule on professionalenergyhealers.com, or they can go directly to the source, to Rosalyn's website, either in the US or the student-ran website in Germany. So, Rosalyn, thank you so much for your time. It's always a personal pleasure and a privilege to talk to you, and we're looking forward to the future, whatever that's going to hold for us.
Me too. I'm always thrilled at the way you elevate our conversation. It really is pleasing.
Oh, thank you.
You're welcome.
Very grateful for that. So thank you, Rosalyn, for a wonderful interview, and look forward to talking to you again in the future.
I hope so.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.